Hi, my name is Kenyatta Brown, and my informative speech is called Reconstructing America. Was it enough? From sit-ins to a million women and men listening to the most historical speech in Washington. The Reconstruction of America was a violent and oppressive one, but it brought a great sense of change and promise. What produced this strange and strong change? It was the Civil Rights Movement, beginning in the 1800s with slavery and ending towards the 1960s. It was a monumental piece in time, and it brought forth activists and leaders and entertainers, artists and musicians alike. These figures were so important to the African American community because they contribute to the movement in their own special way. Each of them brought something different. You have activists and leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. And then you have other figures like Rosa Parks, Thurgood Marshall, W.E. Du Bois, and more. The reason why I chose this topic is because I felt a tie to it. I learned more about the civil rights when I was younger at home, listening to a conversation that my mother was telling me about when she was younger and living in Mississippi. Her family was one of the groups to be integrated into one of the previously segregated schools. And I felt that was so cool that I had my own personal tie to it. So I chose this as my topic, and I went ahead and I did additional research for you guys as well. My goal today is to show you the impact and the importance of why the civil rights movement was so important and how each event was a building block to the future, to where we are now. So let's start from the beginning. The beginning of the civil rights movement was a boiling pot. And in this boiling pot, every event, every experience, every word, every instance was just thrown into the boiling pot, to the point where it just boiled over. And this movement was very much long overdue. And we're going to start in the 1940s. Although the civil rights movement generally started around the Civil War era, I'm going to focus more and touch on the Civil War, but go into the experience instances within. So, in the article called Birth of the Civil Rights Movement from 1941 to 1954 by the National Park Service, the quote said, "The World War II accelerated social change." So you had different minorities in the war, like Blacks, Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, and Mexicans. And they were all drafted into fighting this war. With that being said, they were fighting for a country that wouldn't fight for them, but they were also being killed by their comrades in war and even outside of war. But at home was beginning to start to see a change. In the North, with migration of Blacks, although still racist, the North had more of an opportunity to vote. So with that being said, they were trying to gain support, the political parties trying to gain support, the Democrats and Republicans, to the Blacks, because they needed support or more in numbers. So there was a riot called the Zoot Suit Riot. And in the Zoot Suit Riot was the abuse and the brutal beatings and the attacks of Mexican teenagers because they were not protected. There was no police protection. And then there was the Chinese Americans who thought that America was their ally, but then they soon realized that America had a strong, deep-rooted racism, which made them want to pull back and side otherwise. But the social injustice was beginning to have a severe pressure, and it was going above and beyond. Another quote from the Birth of Civil Rights Movement said that the NAACP, emboldened by the record of Black servicemen in war and new corps of brilliant young lawyers and steady financial support from white philanthropists, initiated major attacks against discrimination and segregation, even in the Jim Crow South. So with that being said, that means that the minorities, especially the African Americans in the Black community, once they came back and once they were discharged for the war, they were trying to show and prove that they are more than just the field hand, that they are more than just the cooks, but they are people who are your chefs, they are your doctors, your teachers, your lawyers, but they are more than what everyone says that they are or what they assume to be. There are groups like the Tuskegee Airmen or the Ladies of the 888 who took part in, again, trying to make a change, trying to make it better, showing that they are smart and educated and talented. As we continue with the timeline down into the 1950s, each moment from the 1940s continue to pile up and build on to moments in the 1950s. In the 1950s, you had things like Brown versus Board of Education, where there were 5 court cases brought to the judge showing them that there was huge gaps and inequalities from white schools and black schools, ending in the court making a unanimous decision, as in quote from the Civil Rights Movement of Library and Congress, says that the U.S. Supreme Court ruled unanimously that the separate educational facilities are inherently unequal, legally ending racial segregation in public schools and overruling the separate but equal principles set forth in the Plessy versus Ferguson in 1889. The decision to begin to desegregate the public schools also influenced public facilities to desegregate as well. Although it was more of teeth pulling and a struggle between the two, because not everybody agreed that blacks and whites should be together, hence the movement. The death of Emmett Till also played and influenced another part, because he was a 14-year-old boy who was kidnapped and taken from his cousin's home. He was brutally beaten, he was killed, and his body was thrown in the Tallahatchie River. This sent a huge uproar and trigger into the African American community because they realized that he is a young boy. So that can mean your brother, your cousin, your sibling, your father, if they had the opportunity, that even yourselves, if you were a young black boy, that you didn't have that sense of safeness or security. And his mother made sure that his face was one of the things the first thing that you saw when you heard about this, because she wanted them to know that that's not okay. You also had in 1955, Rosa Parks' arrest. Although she was not the first woman to be arrested, she was one of the first women who encouraged the movement to the Montgomery bus boycott. And in this Montgomery bus boycott, you had minorities and allies refuse to ride and pay to get on a bus until they were able to be integrated, where anyone can sit where they want. Now, with the Montgomery bus boycott, you had this activist and this strong leader that we all know find his voice and eventually lead the Montgomery bus boycott, as well as the march. And that man himself was Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a man of nonviolence. He wanted to have silent protests. He believed that one day that everybody would be able to come together, and he had gained a following, and his inspirational and emotional and encouraging speeches, including the March on Washington, which has a clip of the I Have a Dream. And I found out myself that even that speech is not called I Have a Dream. It's a part of a speech called the March on Washington. But like Martin Luther King, who was nonviolent, you had Malcolm X, who was different. He wasn't really into the turn the other cheek. He believed in black empowerment and self-defense, and believed that everything that was taken from us was owed to us. You also had allies like Jane Elliott, who found a strong, outrageous uprising when Martin Luther King was assassinated, and she took pride in educating and showing white individuals who believe or want to show them what the inequality and injustice means when it comes to the African American communities. You also had musicians like Sam Cooke, who took the time to use some of his music to express the social injustices in his music, using A Change Is Going to Come. As we continue to move down the timeline, we moved to the 1960s toward the end of the movement, where the African American community made it very clear that they are not going to down without a fight. You had sit-ins like the Greensboro sit-in, where teens came into a diner and they just sat at an all-white diner because they wanted to show that they cannot be shunned or they cannot be treated this way because of the color of their skin. And again, you have the March on Washington, and then you have the bombing in Birmingham, where the 4 little girls were in the basement of a church, and then also caused an uprising because the African American communities realized there was no safe or no sacred place, that anytime and anywhere you could be taken just because of something that you cannot change. As well as the 1964 was the Civil Rights Law was passed, meaning no discrimination between religion, race, color, national origin, or gender. 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed, and that means that there should be no discriminatory actions when it comes to voting. The sad thing is, towards the 60s, you have the assassination of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, and the sad passing of Sam Cooke. But this movement showed that it was more than just a stand for a change. It was a building block of all events and experiences to contribute to a better future. The collective efforts of individuals from different walks of life trying to make the future for a better one. So showing that the need for equality for all minorities was a battle that needed to be had. No matter how big or small, it still made a difference. It still made an impact. Until this day, it influenced other movements like the LGBTQ plus movement and women's rights, and so much more. So the next time that you hear about a civil rights leader and or a figure, please remember that the civil rights movement was a continuous effort with different instances that built on every year on the backs of the previous people before them, paving and creating a way for the generation and the future. Thank you.